Folks, welcome back to Ancient of Days. This is William, or Bill Schnoebelen. Welcome to life.
Well, thank you. It is great to be here and exciting in sunny Roswell. Tonight I'm going to be speaking on the War of the Worlds, and I mean that in a spiritual sense. Essentially UFOs, Masonry, and Satanism in the occult social order. And the reason I got tapped for doing this is because I have a background that's rather extensive in the occult and in Satanism and things of that nature. Next slide. This is our ministry, by the way. This is our little plug real quickly. Our website is withoneaccord.org if you want to look at some of our documents and what have you on there. We have a ministry that's involved in helping people get set free, and we also, of course, preach the gospel and do apologetics against cults, of which obviously the UFO thing is a major thing. Okay, next slide. Essentially, I've been a student of the UFO phenomenon longer than anything else that I've done, except for the fact that I was born a Catholic. I didn't have anything to do with that. So I've been involved with it on and off ever since 1963. But and I think there may be a correlation here, because in my experience, and I've talked to some of the other people here that do this kind of work, and we all pretty much agree that for most people that are victimized by UFO-type phenomenon or are obsessed with it in some other way, it's because, in fact, they have some kind of occult involvement. And that seems to be the case with me. In my case, oddly enough, I had a nun give me a book when I was in, excuse me, 8th grade, by Frank Edwards. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of him. He was one of the kind of Fortean type writers that did a lot of stuff with UFOs. That just totally got me hooked on UFOs. Since that time, and I'm just going to run through this real briefly because we've got a lot of stuff to cover tonight. I was told in college, I wanted to be a priest. My whole life I've been obsessed with religion, as you'll see by the time we're done here tonight. But how many of you realize that religion is not necessarily what Yeshua, Jesus, is all about? He's about something entirely different from religion. But in my case, when I was in minor seminary, I had a professor tell me that I should do the same thing that Jesus did, which is to study the occult, because I was going to be a priest. And in Catholic doctrine, there's this idea that a priest is another Christ. And so therefore, I went and started reading books on the paranormal, books on ESP, on UFOs. And by the time 1968 rolled around, I was a sophomore in college, I'd been initiated a first-degree witch. In 1972, I was ordained a spiritualist minister and a medium. I was trained as a medium with the Alliance of Divine Love. I became a Druidic high priest in 1973, July. I became a Wiccan high priest in September of that same year. Now, for reasons that are best left undiscussed, that same year I also made a legal name change to Christopher P. Sin, S-Y-N, because supposedly that had numerological and karmic relationships that I was supposed to fulfill. In 1974, August, we moved to Milwaukee to start a network of covens there. In 1975, in Milwaukee, I began studying Masonry. I was made an entered apprentice that year in Heartland Lodge number 122. In 1975, I read the Satanic Bible for the first time and ended up joining the Church of Satan. This gets more bizarre, don't worry. In 1976, I was ordained to the Old Roman Catholic priesthood, because you can't be a Satanic priest until first you're a Catholic priest. In 1976, November, I was raised to the sublime degree of a Master Mason, although there's really nothing sublime about it. But 1977, I was made a Knight Templar, which is 10th degree York Rite. Oh, I forgot to say, next slide. This is me as a brand new witch. This is sort of my hippie period. This is taken in 1969. And so as you can see, I got a lot of gray hair since then. And believe it or not, most of this happened all in one night, and if I have time, I'll tell you that story. I became a warlock in the Church of Satan in April of '77. I was made a bishop in the Gnostic Catholic Church, which is a Crowleyan version of the Orthodox Church, in July of that year. In 1977 September, I was created a 90th degree Mason in the Rite of Memphis Mitzrayim. I was also brought into Voodoo that year. And finally, my last step before getting born again, in August of 1980, I was baptized a Mormon. And that same year, I was also made a Shrine Noble, a 32nd degree Mason, and I got a master's degree in theology from a Catholic seminary. You think I was a little confused spiritually? So let's see, at the same time, I was a Mormon, I was getting a Catholic theology degree, I was a Shriner, and supposedly you can't be a Catholic and a Mason at the same time. And I was also practicing Voodoo, and, you know, one thing I didn't mention, I was also a practicing vampire. So, pretty bizarre stuff. Well, I finally received the Grand Sovereign Inspector General 33rd degree in Continental Freemasonry. That means it was a degree from Europe, not from America. Then I attained 34th degree in the Palladium in January of 1981. In May of that year, I was finally, change the slide here. This is a picture of me as a Satanic priest. As you can see, I kind of cut my hair and stuff, but actually, this was taken right about the time I have short hair at that time because I had to work as a security guard. And that's the funny thing. I mean, everybody tells you, if you join the Satanic religion, you'll get wealthy and rich and powerful beyond your wildest dreams. And I was working as a security guard for minimum wage. So it just shows you the devil's a liar, amen? Anyhow, the funny thing that happened to me on the way to being a Mormon, I was called to be an institute teacher. Now, the Church Institute of Church Educational System is an adult education thing. It's an arm of Brigham Young University. And I was asked to teach a course in the New Testament. See, the amazing thing you've got to understand about my story is even though I had a master's degree from a Catholic seminary in theology, I never read the Bible. I had never read Paul's epistles, even though I took a course in Pauline theology. Got good grades in it, too, but for all the good it did me. So, for the first time in my life, I had to actually read the entire New Testament from cover to cover. And you know, you've probably heard the expression, how a broken clock is right twice a day. Well, that's true of the Mormon Church. They got one thing right, at least. They used the King James Bible for their Bible. So I actually read through, and the more I read in the Bible, the more I realized that Paul could not have been a Mormon. I realized that I read, Galatians 1:8 about if I or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel than the one that I have preached, let him be accursed. And I also read 1 Corinthians 15, which of course says, Paul defines his gospel. He says that what I delivered unto you is that Christ died on the cross and he rose from the dead and was seen of many. So that's the gospel. There's nothing in there about wearing magic underwear or going to the temple or doing genealogy or any of the 4,000 other things Mormons are supposed to do. So I finally, in June 22nd, 1984, I knelt at the foot of my bed and gave my heart to the Lord, asked him to be the Lord and Savior of my life. And guess what? He did it. Hallelujah. So that was the beginning of my new life. I told you all of that, and that's probably the quickest I've ever done my testimony. That's like light speed, for me. If you want the full version, you can either get our book, Lucifer Dethroned, or you can get on our website and get a video that's called Exposing the Illuminati from Within. Oh, I forgot to tell you, I also was inducted into the Illuminati. I left that one out for some reason. Just a little thing, I want to add, next slide. Important thing. What did all these apparently different organizations have in common? Well, as we shall see, the commonality in all things was that they all have something to do with UFOs. Now, that might surprise you, but you're going to see how all this comes together in a really very sinister little web. Next slide. Basically, we're going to be operating on certain principles. I don't think any of these are going to be news to you, except unless maybe this is your first time at this kind of a conference. We're going to use the Bible as our absolute standard of truth, both in terms of doctrine and also in terms of history. And also the other thing is that while the Bible does not discuss aliens or, flying saucers per se, we believe there are significant prophetic implications in the current connection between the UFO phenomenon and, for example, the New Age movement, the various saucer cults, the witchcraft and satanic movements, and also with Freemasonry. Next slide. well, I'm going to kind of go through this fairly fast because it's already been talked about several times, but I think a key warning for our day is what is in Luke 17:26. Yeshua, Jesus said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man." And of course, the only sin that was really specifically mentioned, although I'm sure there was plenty of other wickedness going on, was the fact that the sons of God were coming down to marry the daughters of men. And of course, that produced the giants in the earth and the Nephilim. So, next slide. You're going to get slightly different viewpoints on this, and since I'm one of the last people to talk, you're going to get mine last. I do agree. I think that the UFO phenomenon is essentially a demonic / fallen angelic phenomenon. In my personal theology, as I understand the Bible, I think there's a difference between demons and fallen angels. They're entirely two different things. It's like comparing a mosquito to a human being to compare a demon to a fallen angel, just so we're clear on that. And we've done like 10 or 12, 15 years of doing deliverance on people too as part of our ministry. So we've had a lot of opportunities to, to test that theory empirically. What happens here is that this angelic activity is a source of much of the reporting on alien activity and supposed alien races. Next slide. Now, the way I look at this, and this may be different from how some of the other speakers do, but when you look at the various classic alien races that are supposedly out there in ufology, you have the Nordics, you have the reptilians, and you have the Greys. Those are the main classifications. There are also sub-classifications. What I believe is that when you see a Nordic, I hope you don't, but if you do, you're looking at a fallen angel in a more pristine condition. Because obviously angels are beautiful beings in their original state. The problem is that if you're a fallen angel, you've just cut yourself off from the one source of beauty, of creativity, of love, and of power. So what happens? You start resembling your new father, the worm, the dragon, the serpent. And so gradually, fallen angels start degenerating. Like I say, they're gone to seed, and they end up looking reptilian. They end up looking like these, draconian or reptilian or whatever you want to call them, forms of aliens. They're still very dangerous and they're still very powerful. And I believe, and I mean, again, there's different opinions on this, they can briefly shapeshift and appear to be human, but that their natural state is like this. In terms of the Greys, who are, of course, the real famous aliens, you see these things all over town here, I think the Greys are essentially genetic experimentation of the fallen angels that didn't work out very well. So therefore they're functioning kind of like drones. They're like the workers. I don't think they're very smart. In my experience, they're kind of almost robot-like in what they do. So that's how I look at things. And so I think there, in my humble opinion, I think there really are, fallen angelic technologies out there. I think there are spacecraft or whatever you want to call them, aircraft that really do exist in the physical plane. I don't think it's all just, somehow spiritual or holograms or whatever. But again, that's not a thing we need to debate. Next slide. I think behind all of this are very high-level angelic powers, because a lot of people, they think, well, okay, fallen angels, that's fine, but we forget about what Paul tells us in Ephesians 6:12. He talks about principalities and powers. Again, the word archon has been already mentioned, which is the Greek that's used in here. Rulers of the darkness, spiritual wickedness in high places. Again, this was discussed earlier. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But these are beings that, again, a whole other order of magnitude above fallen angels. These are the Elohim, the gods, if you will, plural, members of the divine council. And again, Michael has already talked about that, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time with it. Next slide. Now, I take it for granted as an operating premise that some fallen angels, or of whatever variety, are at the pinnacle of all false religious systems, promoting deception to keep people away from true salvation. So, for example, there's a principality that's over Freemasonry. There's a principality that's over Mormonism. There's a principality that is over different, UFO type groups, and and of course, it's not like these things are all separate. Satan has a hierarchy, and it might be a kind of chaotic, disorganized hierarchy. My experience with it when I was in Satanism is that the hierarchy, it's kind of like the mafia. You knock each other off, you beat each other up, and whoever gets on top, ends up winning, and that's, of course, the exact antithesis of the kingdom of heaven. But you would expect that. So I believe there's a network of these beings. You talk about a conspiracy, and I think, anybody who's literate in the Bible, who understands what the scriptures say, would be a blank fool not to say that, yes, there is a conspiracy out there. There's a conspiracy both at this level and to a lesser degree even on the physical human level. But the humans are just the puppets. And these fallen angels are, in fact, the ones that we really need to worry about. There's a network of beings that is responsible for the administration of UFO cults in general, Freemasonry, Satanism, and every other group that's out there that is a counterfeit gospel, because all these things offer a counterfeit gospel that is not of Yeshua or Jesus. Next slide. Now, this talk is going to be partly anecdotal and autobiographical. It's going to be partly historical and explanatory, but I often get asked by people, do you think you were abducted or something as a child? Because you got to understand something. People look at my life and they think, well, what were you, insane or something? Because not many people end up, being a Satanist and drinking human blood and, snorting cocaine until it's coming out their eyeballs. It's just not the typical. When you have someone, they say, I was raised in a very nice household. My parents were devout Catholics. They were wonderful people. It was very much a leave it to beaver childhood in every sense of the word. And so people ask me, well, why did you end up being so weird? I tell, hey, it's all me. I can't say, oh, my father, beat me, or my mother, made me dress funny or something like that. It's all me. But there are some rather strange things that were going on. From the time I was 6 or 7 years old, I was intrigued by flying saucers. And in the 1950s, that's a tiny bit remarkable because there wasn't as much of it out in the media as there is today. My parents wouldn't even let me see science fiction movies or horror movies. I think the first anything like that I saw was The Time Machine, and that was like in the early 60s. But I had this unexplained experience or interest in the paranormal. And I had 3 significant life experiences I want to talk about that may have something to do with my very strange spiritual trajectory. The first one, and you can look at these that I'm about to suggest, and if you look at them from one standpoint, it's kind of looking at a sculpture. You can look at it from different perspectives. If you look at it from one standpoint, you can say, oh, well, that's some kind of occult defilement. Or you could look at it from another sense and say, wow, that's some weird alien thing. So let's just see what we got here. When I was about 11 years old, 12 years old, somewhere in there, I went out trick-or-treating. Back then it was, nobody ever had any teaching that was not something you should let your kids do. So I went out every year and went trick-or-treating. I always looked forward to it. And I was out with my friend, and we were going door to door. It was a beautiful, clear October night. And all of a sudden I was walking along, I looked up at the sky. And instead of the sky being this beautiful canopy of stars, it was totally black. And from one horizon to the other, as far as I could see, there were these black, leathery beings clinging to the dome of the sky. They looked half like bats and half like something else. And they had red eyes, and those red eyes opened. And they blinked down at me, and I felt this shiver go through my entire being. And I was just sort of transfixed by this. And my friend had kept walking. And he all of a sudden turned around and realized I was like 10 feet behind him. And he says, hey, Bill, what's going on? And I looked at him, and I looked up, and it was the sky again. But I felt somehow unclean. I felt like I had been touched by something, even though at that age I didn't even understand what that meant. But I felt like I needed a shower. Well, a few years after that, and I'd already started getting interested in the occult, Every other summer, my parents would go up to Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and they'd rent a cabin up there, and we'd spend a week on this lake up there. It was very nice. Although I don't know if any of you have heard about Wisconsin, but Wisconsin is like the strangest state in the Union. Amen? You know, and it's not just because they're cheeseheads or something. I mean, there's an awful lot of weird people in the north woods of Wisconsin. And I lived in Wisconsin for 10 years, so I think I can say that. I mean, this is a state that produced Jeffrey Dahmer, that produced Ed Gein, that, you know, and those are just the famous ones. There's all sorts of, there's actually a whole book about this. It's called Wisconsin Death Trip. And if you go up in north woods of Wisconsin, you're going to see some things up there that are totally bizarre. Well, what happened to me is my parents had gone out, and they left me in the cabin, and I was sitting on the dock looking at this beautiful, pristine lake at night, you know. And all of a sudden, the trees started moving like they were blowing in the wind, but there was no wind. It was as still. In fact, the first thing you got to worry about is when all of a sudden all the little night creatures shut up. Amen. You know, that's when you need to start worrying, because there's no crickets, no frogs, no nothing, you know. And all of a sudden all the trees are going like this in utter silence. There was no wind. And the hair just kind of stood up on the back of my neck. I was sitting on this dock, cross-legged. And then all of a sudden I started hearing this wind, like this gale force wind, but the trees stopped moving. And I was looking across the lake, and I could see the cabins on the other side of the lake, and all of a sudden something loomed up on the horizon and blotted out the stars. And it rose and it rose, and it was like this ink blot just covering up the stars. And gradually I could tell what it was, you know how it is up in the north woods. I mean, the sky is so clear. And I could gradually make it out. It was actually a giant humanoid form that bestrode the heavens. And it like went like this and went over the top of me like it was striding over me like I was an ant. And I could actually see the legs striding behind me somewhere, and then it was gone. And then all of a sudden the little night creatures started chirping again, and the trees stopped blowing or whatever. And I just went, what was that? You know. Later on I learned from studying in the occult that it was what they call in the North Woods either the windwalker. It's a Native American thing. But again, you could look at that and think, well, boy, that was kind of a UFO, wasn't it? You know. Now, the more suggestive one is the one I'm about to tell you. Several times in my adolescent years, I would wake up and I'd be laying in the backyard of our house naked. Now, that's kind of weird because I slept with pajamas on. And I have no memories of anything weird going on, no aliens sticking metal objects up my nose or anything. I have nothing to take that to. But I know on numerous occasions that happened, probably 5 or 6 times. And, you know, looking back on it now, because you see, this was like the mid-'60s. I had not run across the story of the hills and which I think the first documented report of someone having missing time and alien abductions. I just thought I was sleepwalking. And maybe that's all it was, but I guess in the process of sleepwalking, I took off my pajamas. So anyhow, that was I think, something that might have brought me into this realm where I started looking for weird things. Next slide. Basically, I went to college. I already kind of told you how I got involved with witchcraft. And part of we met this man, quite an extraordinary fellow. He was the Grand Master of all Druids, and he claimed that there had been a conjunction in the heavens in 1972 that had been assigned to him, that he was supposed to go forth into the outside world and once again teach Druidism to the world. That he was an ancestor of Scottish immigrants that had fled the British Isles under the persecution of Cromwell, because Cromwell was going after witches and Druids big time. So he lived up in the mountains of Arkansas. And we went down to study under him. And this was quite a fellow. He was a Grand Master Druid of North America. He was also a 33rd degree Mason and a Mormon bishop. So, you know, and the guy had an enormous knowledge of the occult. And the way it worked is he had this like commune type of thing, and during the morning we had to work for him. That was the way we kind of paid off our classes. And then afternoon, we would sit at a picnic table and he would teach us about astrology and the occult and all this strange stuff. And then at night, after dinner, we'd have another, because it was cooler then, you know, we'd have more classes. Now, what was very, very strange is that after about a week of being down there, we were all sitting at this table. It was beautiful, beautiful summer night. And all of a sudden, this silent, and all I can describe it as was a UFO, came over the horizon. And it was like a big round thing, or kind of oval-shaped thing with lights all around it. And it totally silent. And it stopped right over the mountaintop and just hovered there for the entire class. And we were all, there was like about 6 or 8 of us in this group. And we all kind of looked at each other like, should we say something? You know, I mean, because he was just totally like, oh, there's a UFO up in the sky. And the thing looked huge. I mean, it was, you know, it looked, to me, it looked like the what do they call it, the bottom part of a dirigible, you know, like on the Goodyear blimp. You know, the part that they have the people in, the gondola, that's the word I'm looking for. But it was absolutely silent. We could actually see figures. They appeared to be humanoid figures looking out the windows at us. And finally, after a couple of nights, because this happened like maybe 20 times over the course of the summer, finally we got up the nerve to ask him, well, what is that? You know, and he just sort of smiled knowingly and just sit there and kind of like, let's just get back to our studies, you know. So that was really very strange, because it was the first time I'd ever seen what appeared to me to be a genuine UFO. And it was, I mean, I would guess it was probably 200 or 300 feet above us in the sky. The other thing that happened at that time is we all stayed in tents. And one night we were trying to get ready for sleep, and all of a sudden I felt this presence. Now, mind you, at this time I was a trance medium. I was an ordained spiritualist minister. And I was used to going into trance and having, you know, spirit guides speak through me and ascended masters speak through me. And of course, it's all demonic. But at that time, I didn't understand that. But this was different. I felt some very powerful presence come into me that I couldn't fight off. And it was this utterly alien intelligence. I mean, it was like something was almost trying to erase my brain and put some wholly other kind of cerebral method of processing stuff in my head instead. And my wife, well, at that time we weren't married yet, Sharon, she realized something was going on, and she started trying to use all of this magical stuff to throw it out. And finally, you know, she loves telling this story. One of many times she saved my life, I think. She jumped on top of me, pulled out her anathema, which is like this witch dagger, and she stuck it at my throat. And she says, basically, you've got one choice, what's ever in there. Two choices, either leave or I'm going to cut his throat, and you won't have a body anyway. And so the thing just whoosh like that, and it left. And I felt totally drained by it. And that's when I got my first gray hairs. So what was that? It could have been just an attempt at possession by a very high-level demonic being, or it could have been something else. Next slide. After that, we moved to Milwaukee because we had 80 people that wanted us to teach them how to become witches. So we went there and got an apartment. 1 week later, got firebombed out of our apartment. At this time, you would start thinking, don't you think some intelligent person would maybe figure out you're on the wrong path here, you know? I mean, you try to get demon-possessed, you get a firebomb thrown in your window, you know, duh. But I didn't get it. And I was also functioning as a trance medium at that time. I'd give readings for people. We were involved with Freemasonry at that time. Also ceremonial magic, and I don't know if you understand, ceremonial magic is what is called high magic. It's kind of like, if you've heard of the difference, like in the Anglican Church, they talk about high church versus low church. Well, high magic is where you get to wear, remember that robe you saw me in a few minutes ago in that one photo? You wear real fancy robes, you have incense burners, you have candles, you have, you know, all of this stuff, and you do very elaborate, some of the rituals take 6 months to perform, things like that. We were also very much into Aleister Crowley. I don't know, probably a lot of you know who he is, but he was basically the leading ceremonial magician and Luciferian occultist of the 20th century. We're into Enochian magic. Now, that doesn't have much to do with the Book of Enoch. That's a magical system that Dr. John Dee, who was the original 007. Did you know that? Dr. John Dee. He was a secret agent for Queen Elizabeth I, and his number was 007. And he also was a very high-level occultist, and he summoned up this angel that called himself Enoch, and he brought through this incredibly complex magical system. It's called Enochian magic. And just to show you how powerful this stuff is, the whole last third of the infamous Satanic Bible is made up of Enochian calls, which are the 19 calls or keys of the Enochian system. And they're very, very dangerous if you know how to use them. Then we also got into Goetia. Goetia comes from a corrupted form of a word that means howling. And it's where you do these real strange kind of incantations that are so far away from any kind of normal human speech, it indeed sounds like you're howling. Next slide. Anyway, these wonderful spirit guides that I trusted so much, one night in January of 1978, they told me I was to go out at midnight, this is in January, mind you, in Wisconsin, to a nearby park and wait for a UFO. And I thought, well, this is interesting, you know, because, of course, we'd had that experience down in Arkansas, and I was still very interested in UFOs at this time. So I was obedient to the heavenly vision. I went there to the park and got out of my car and walked down to where I was supposed to be. And a large oval ship, it didn't look like the one I'd seen in Arkansas, but it was sort of a vaguely similar design, hovered over the park, came in, and the light just, and this was like, you know, after midnight, the light just suffused the whole park, and I remember it kind of burning into my brain, and that's all I remember, except in kind of a dreamlike way. And you know what was very strange about what I remembered? I remember being standing there before like this panel, this committee that mostly looked human, although there were a couple of people who looked very alien on it, and they were grilling me about my knowledge of Masonic secrets. They were asking me questions. In Masonry, you have to memorize certain things, and they were seeing how good my memory was. They were giving me this Masonic catechism back and forth. That's all I remember, and then the next thing I know, I was laying on the ground, freezing to death in the middle of this park in January. So, you know, now that's probably the closest thing I've had to actually some sort of a UFO thing up to that point. Okay, next slide. I mentioned Aleister Crowley. We're going to talk about him more now. This guy wrote very copiously, but this is the most pertinent thing. He said there are beings of intelligence and power far beyond, of a far higher quality than anything we conceive of as human. They are not necessarily based on the cerebral and nervous structures that we know, and that the one and only chance for mankind to advance as a whole is for individuals to make contact with such beings. So this is the guy who boasted that he was the evilest man of the 20th century. And this is what he was teaching to his disciples. Next slide. He was a brilliant but evil individual. And oddly enough, this guy was the ultimate preacher's kid nightmare. His parents owned a brewery. And at some point, right before he was born, his father got born again. And he became a member of the I think it's called the Select Plymouth Brethren, which is a very, very strict evangelical sect. And he sold the brewery and used a lot of the money from selling it because he didn't think it was appropriate to run a brewery anymore, which I would agree with. And he went and traveled around preaching. He was like an itinerant preacher. So little Edward Alexander Crowley, which was his birth name, was raised by his mother. And his mother was very, very, let's just put it this way, she could have really benefited from a high colonic. Very, very strict. And any time he would disobey, and let's face it, kids disobey, you know, that's what kids do sometimes. Finally, she started saying, "You're such a disobedient child, you're like the great beast." And so she started calling him the great beast. I mean, talk about negative reinforcement, amen? So when Crowley grew up, he took that as a badge of honor. And when he went to Cambridge, one of the first things he did was he got a toad from the biology laboratory, baptized the toad, by immersion no less, as Jesus Christ, and then crucified it upside down. And that was his way of basically spitting on his parents' religion. And since that time, he basically went on and started drinking and carousing, and then he found the Golden Dawn, which was the consummate occult society of 19th century England. And he joined that, and from there he basically went on to become an extraordinary occultist. He was a poet, a mountain climber, and he could play 8 chess games blindfolded and win. He was also the leading ceremonial magician of his day and a Luciferian. Next slide. Something happened in 1904. He married this lady, poor woman, Rose Kelly. Every woman he ever got involved with ended up either committing suicide or becoming an alcoholic or a drug addict. But for their honeymoon, he decided he wanted to go to Egypt and spend their honeymoon night in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. So that's what they did. He did a magical ritual there that night, and he said the chamber, which is very dark, of course, because they don't have lights in there, was suffused with a blue light. Well, the next day they went to the Cairo Museum to do some, looking around at the artifacts, and his wife all of a sudden walked down to this deserted corridor to the end, and there was this Egyptian artifact that's called a stele, S-T-E-L-E, and she went up to it, and she said, like she was in a trance, "This is Ankafnakon Su." And he went up and he looked at it, and he looked down, and it was exhibit number 666 in the museum. And he had this epiphany. And he thought at that moment, yes, I'm the reincarnation of this priest prince, Ankafnakon Su. So they went back to their hotel room. She ended up going into a trance and told him that he should sit down and receive this book. He got this book, which is called Liber Alvel Legis. In English, it means the Book of the Law. And this is like the holy book of the Crowleyan religion. The religion is called Thelema, which is the Greek word for will. And it's cardinal, just like, like in Judaism, you have the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, and in Christianity, we have the Golden Rule. Well, the total thing of Thelema was, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, love is the law, love under will. And he believed this was the beginning of a new age. He thought that the Christian religion was part of the Aeon of Osiris, who was a slain and risen God, and that now it was going away, and that the new age would be the Aeon of the crown and conquering child. And this was in 1904. Well, anyway, next slide. The deities that are talked about in this book are called Nuit, Hadit, and Rehur Kuit. And Nuit is a star goddess, Hadit is like her consort, and Rehur Kuit is the hawk-headed god of war. He's often known as Horus, if you're familiar with Egyptian mythology. And Crowley was one of the first magicians to openly talk about gods from other planets or galaxies. In the course of what he was doing, he did what was called the Amalantra working. Next slide. In January through March of 1918, he did one of these very, very elaborate ceremonial magical workings in Central Park West of New York City. And at least one intelligence was brought into physical manifestation. In other words, this being appeared via a magical portal that they opened. They believe they opened the very fabric of space and time and allowed this being to come through. And this is a portrait by Crowley taken from life of what this being looked like. Next slide. Does that look a little familiar? I mean, it's really, the eyes are a little different, but it's very, very similar to the classic gray, alien. This entity identified itself as Lam, L-A-M. Next slide. And this is stuff this guy is Aleister Crowley's successor, Kenneth Grant. Crowley died in 1947, and he is now the outer head of the order of the OTO, which is an occult order, Ordo Templi Orientis, that Crowley was made the head of. And according to him, Lam is a link between the star systems of Sirius and Andromeda. Lam is the gateway to the void. Notice that. It's number 71, and that's in Gematria, which is the Hebrew numbering system, is 71. That's the number of no thing. Lam is a great old one whose countenance is recognizable in all accounts of UFO occupants. Lam has been invoked to fulfill the work set afoot by Aiwass, as a reflex of Aiwass. Now, Aiwass is the being that dictated the Book of the Law. He's supposedly like the John the Baptist of the new aeon. Aiwass is a spirit. He's not a human being. Excuse me, next slide. Now, 1 year before Crowley died, and oddly enough, he died in 1947, the year of the Roswell crash, two of his disciples, L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons. Have you heard of L. Ron Hubbard? Sure. The guy that founded Dianetics and Scientology. Anyway, they decided they were going to try and carry this thing further. And they did what was called the Babalon working in 1946 January. And again, this is right before the birth of the flying saucer with Kenneth Arnold and the Roswell crash just a year before that. They did a further magical working, and they called it the Babalon working. And the purpose of this was, in fact, to invoke the Scarlet Woman, who was supposed to be the consort of the beast. Next slide. They opened the porthole wider, and they wanted these extra cosmic intelligences as influences to enter this known universe more freely. And what seems to have happened, they believe, is that they accomplished the drastic enlargement of ripping open of an existing magical portal and then not being able to close it again. And perhaps the rip they created was not possible to close. And it really caused a lot of catastrophic things, the most obvious of which is that Jack Parsons, he's the guy that founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He was a rocket scientist, and just a few weeks after this, he was blown to bits in a jet fuel explosion in his laboratory. But see, this is powerful, dangerous stuff. Don't let anybody tell you that magic isn't real. It is. It's just that it doesn't come from where magicians think it comes from. They believe it comes from within themselves or from these external entities. Actually, it comes from the demonic realm, and it's totally deceptive. Okay, next slide. Today, some Crowleyite OTO-type groups believe that attracting this Lam consciousness is the best way of facilitating the growth of the Lucifer gnosis in human evolution. Now, I think you heard Michael before talk about gnosis and Gnostics. That basically means knowledge. Gnostics are people that believe you're saved by secret knowledge. And so what they're saying here is that if you want to achieve the knowledge of Lucifer, you need to get in touch with this Lam consciousness. Now, according to Kenneth Grant, here's what you have to do. Acquire a portrait of Lam, gaze intently at it, especially on its eyes. Kenneth Grant says this: to gaze into the eyes of this entity is to invite potent contact. One feels an immediate sensation of lightness, of weightlessness, then a sensation of falling, of being sucked into a vortex. Next slide. Now, I'm sure some of you realize that is also reported about the gray aliens. That if you look in their eyes, you kind of go off somewhere, you feel weightless, you feel, like you're sort of caught in cotton candy, you lose all sense of time and space. It's apparent there's a strong connection between these Lam entities and the gray aliens. Does this mean that Lam and the Greys are essentially the same sort of entity with the same agenda? And I would ask this: are the Greys being used to further a Luciferian agenda through varieties of black magic and black science? Let me explain what I mean by those two terms. Black magic is obviously more familiar, but in the occult, black magic is magic that is worked for selfish or evil purposes. That's how it's defined. White magic is magic that's used for good purposes, like healing someone or helping someone get a job or something like that. Actually, both black and white magic are evil, but, they're both forbidden by Yahweh God. Black science, though, is something different. Black science is my term. I don't know if I coined it or not, but it's a term I use in my book, Space Invaders. It refers to science that is unorthodox. It's not supposed to exist. Probably some of the things such as Stan Dale was talking about. I'm not saying it's evil science. I'm just saying it's science that is outside the normal pale, and that most scientists would deny it even exists. Okay, next slide. There's another strange piece to this puzzle, and some of you may have heard of him. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died in 1937, born in 1890. He is the author of some very strange, they're hard to classify. They're not science fiction exactly, they're not horror exactly, they're not fantasy exactly. But they're very, very disturbing books. He was born in an upper middle class family in Providence, Rhode Island. He had a lonely childhood, and as a result, he read voraciously. Gee, that sounds like me. I was an only child, by the way. That might go a long way to explain some of my weirdness. The unique element in this guy's stories is how he blended horror, fantasy, and science fiction. Originally, he wanted to be an astronomer. He wrote, his first story was called The Hound, and he wrote it in 1922. His stories are all subtle, chilling, and very disturbing. Of course, he was writing, you know, like 80 years ago. So his tales are all very discreet. I mean, it's not like you're reading a Stephen King novel where there's blood gushing everywhere or sex or violence or anything. He talks about unnameable horrors and things like that. But he achieves some very, very chilling effects nevertheless. He eventually began writing full-time, and his tales began appearing in the magazine Weird Tales, which was like a pulp magazine, back in 1923. This man never married and spent most of his life as a recluse living with his maiden aunts. With lushly purple prose, Lovecraft created a cosmos full of supposed elder gods and great old ones, who were allegedly old when the God of the Bible was young. So these are very, very ancient beings. And what supposedly happened in his worldview is that there were the great old ones, and the elder gods came along and tricked them into trapping them in another dimension. And the elder gods are supposedly good, and the great old ones are supposedly very evil, but they're actually beyond evil and good. Next slide. This slide I got off a website about Lovecraft because we conjured up one of these deities once, and it towered over Lake Michigan. It towered over the Marine National Exchange Bank, which is like 50 stories high. And that, oddly enough, caught very much what it looked like. They're shapeless things. These are the main deities in his system: Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, Thulhu, Ithaqua, Shub-Niggurath, and Dagon. Of all of these, one is one you might recognize from the Old Testament. Dagon was a god of the Phoenicians. He's a fish god. All of these correspond to certain things. Let me read you what he said. This will give you an idea of Lovecraft's prose. This is what he wrote about Azathoth. Azathoth lives at the heart of the galaxy in what's called the coal sack, the very heart of our galaxy. He's called that last amorphous blight of nethermost confusion that blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity. The boundless demon sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud, and who gnaws hungrily in inconceivable unlighted chambers beyond time, amidst the muffled, maddening beating of vile drums and the thin, monotonous whine of accursed flutes, to which the detestable pounding and piping dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly the gigantic ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, tenebrous, mindless other gods, whose soul and messenger is the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. That's one sentence. I get chills just reading it, mainly because I've faced some of these entities. Nyarlathotep figured very prominently in an experience I had. Cthulhu is a sea being who supposedly sleeps under the sea in the dead city of Urlier, and he only reaches us through our dreams. Ithaqua is the windwalker. That's what I think I saw on that dock in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Shub-Niggurath is an giant, unspeakable earthworm thing. And of course, Dagon is another sea deity. Next slide. Though regarded as fiction by most readers, an incredible cult following, in more than one sense of the word, has arisen around Lovecraft's pantheon of world-shattering gods. And several occult masters have commented on how closely these resemble the pantheon of solar phallic deities from Crowley's system. See, here's what Lovecraft in his stories, there's very often no women in any of his stories. There's usually the hero, if I can call him that, is some very shy, scholarly person who gets his hands on this incredibly evil book called the Necronomicon. And they find out from this book how to open doorways in other dimensions, and they end up facing these deities and going mad. Okay, next slide. Is this really entirely fictional? And does it matter? Next slide. Kenneth Grant actually believes that Lovecraft had accessed some ancient and very evil archetypes. And he thought this was a good thing, of course, unlike any sane person. So, you know, he basically felt that there's so much similarity between some of these names that it was amazing. Now, the other thing is that some researchers have discovered, like, one of his stories, let me just preface it by saying this, one of Lovecraft's stories is called A Shadow over Innsmouth. And it's set in this New England town where these horrible half-human, half-sea monster creatures shamble out of the sea, and they go and worship at the Masonic Lodge in Innsmouth. And what they do is they've gradually taken over the town. And all these residents of this town are all like horrible genetic experiments gone awry. And they're like half fish or half frog and half human. Now, what is intriguing about that is Lovecraft's grandfather, according to research that I've read, was an adept of Egyptian Freemasonry, which is a very high-level kind of masonry I was involved in. And according to some researchers, he had access to some of these books. And though Lovecraft claims his works were fiction, he lived his own life as if they were not fiction. Two books that are mentioned most prominently in his work are the Necronomicon and the Von Aussprechlichen Kulten, which means of unspeakable cults. And basically, there is actually a Necronomicon out there that you can buy, and it's actually fake. You can go and get it at any Barnes and Noble bookstore, but it's actually a very, very pallid reflection. I've seen the real Necronomicon, and it's very, very dangerous. You don't even want to get near the thing. What's interesting about Lovecraft is that even though he said his works were fiction, he acted like he was haunted his whole life. Though he lived in Providence, he was terrified of being near the ocean. He lived the life of a hermit and a recluse, mainly communicating with friends by mail. He seemed to have a morbid terror of ever going underground. He wouldn't go into a basement. He would never go into a subway or anything like that because he knew that's where these beings lurked. He was morose and sickly and died at the fairly young age of 47. Next slide. But how does this all fit in with UFOs? Well, for the first time in fiction, Lovecraft was portraying transdemonic entities as if they were science fiction characters from distant space or time. Whether by chance or malignant inspiration, he captured the concept of incredibly alien entities who come to Earth and destroy and corrupt the souls of men. Next slide. This was a spiritual war of the worlds, and it's actually very close to the truth. Again, if you read abduction literature, quite often you'll see where when people are confronted by the Greys or whatever, they're paralyzed with fear. They're paralyzed with terror. And I know, for example, Whitley Strieber, however he says his name, he talks about how in his abduction experiences that they're just this kind of nameless dread, and that's exactly what Lovecraft so successfully described, because the human soul, when it comes in contact with this kind of implacable evil, it just withers up like an old geranium. And I did this kind of magic. It's called trans-Yuguan magic, because in Lovecraft's system, the planet Pluto is called Yuggoth. And this magic comes from beyond our solar system, so it's called trans-Yuguan magic. And I'll tell you, it's the most dangerous stuff I've ever done. Next slide. Like the Greys, I kind of talked about this, the great old ones can inspire unspeakable terror in those who see them. Serious magicians have had access to the real Necronomicon for years. And this is important. Necronomicon rituals are designed to open portals or gates to allow the great old ones to pass into our universe. And notice again, like Crowley, he died in the year 1947. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. The interesting thing is, even this bogus Necronomicon, it has some fragments of the real one in it. When it first came out, it came out in a limited edition of 666 copies. And the Occult bookstore in Milwaukee had one on the shelf. And they sold it to a fellow who was a very advanced ceremonial magician. He took it home that night, and his little girl, 3 years old, went in the bathroom, locked the door, cut her wrist with a razor, and killed herself. So he took the book back. This just illustrates the power of this book. The next guy that bought the book, he took it home. He lived in a high-rise over Lake Michigan, and as soon as he walked in the door, he had this beautiful black cat. The black cat took one look at the book, went like that, started running around in circles as fast as it could, just like a black streak, and then it just went out the window, smashed through this tempered glass window, and fell 30 stories to its death. He took the book back. Guess who bought it next? Amazingly, I'm still here, you know. And I mean, I can look back and I can see so many places where Yahweh had his hand on me, where he kept me safe, you know, in spite of all the dumb, stupid things I did. And I just give him all the glory for that, because otherwise I'd be frying in hell right now, I'm sure of it. But notice this thing here. These rituals are designed to open up portals to allow the old ones back into our universe. And I think that's why partly we're seeing more and more, because we used to do these rituals. Next slide. Oh. You can't understand the impact Lovecraft has had in our popular culture. Dozens of books and stories have been inspired by Lovecraft. Movies. I don't know if you ever heard of this H.R. Giger, or Giger, I'm not sure how he says his name. He's actually a member of the Swiss OTO, which is a Crowleyan cult. He's a very, very bizarre artist, and he's the one who designed the original Alien for the movie Alien. And he said he got his inspiration for his art by meditating on the works of H.P. Lovecraft. And I'm sure probably a lot of you have seen the movie. It's considered a horror classic. But that is very similar to some of the things you see when you conjure up these kind of entities. Interestingly enough, the sequel to the Satanic Bible is called the Satanic Rituals. And it actually has 2 authentic Lovecraftian or trans-Yuguan rites in it. So, you know, this stuff is constantly going around and is out there all the time. Now, when the typical UFO person or occultist approaches these subjects from the direction of faith or science, or at least pseudoscience, Lovecraft, Cthulhu mythos, which is what this whole thing is called, comes to the same subject as black magic. And it's just amazing how all this stuff correlates. Next slide. Now we're going to get more into some autobiographical material. Let's see here. I want to say this one thing. I don't want to get into a debate academically over whether or not Lovecraft's mythos is real. Some people say it isn't, some people say it is. The point is to understand that almost 85 years ago he began tapping into something of the human psyche which both satanic magicians and fallen angels have very much wanted to cultivate. He's pulling these things, he's dead now, but I mean he was pulling these things out of his own psyche from the very depths and most horrible parts, and now they're being used worldwide in satanic rituals. Okay. Tunneling through space with cocktails. How's that for a subtitle? The guy who taught me about half of what I know about black magic was a very strange Gnostic archbishop. I talk about this extensively in my book, Lucifer Dethroned. this gentleman who's still alive, and he's still got a presence on the web, but I'm not going to tell you his name because he's that dangerous. He was a very weird individual. He was a deacon in the Anglican Church, Episcopal Church, sorry, and he was sent as a missionary down to Haiti. And while he was down in Haiti, he happened to run across the Pope of Voodoo. Did you know there was a Pope of Voodoo? And at that time, the Pope of Voodoo was Hector Francois Germain. And he brought him into the highest levels of Voodoo. And at that point, he decided, I'm going to leave behind my career as an Episcopal clergyman, and I'm going to become a Voodoo Hierophant. And by the way, this is a white man. And not that that matters, but most people think of Voodoo as being primarily an African-American or African type thing. And it really isn't. This guy had me come down and study under him. And I'll tell you, he was, he'd do things like we'd get up in the morning and we'd have to have cocktails in the morning, which is a little weird. Then he'd have us say the Divine Office, which is this book of prayers that Catholic and Anglican clergy use. Then we'd have to say rosaries. Then we'd go do obscene satanic rituals for a while. Then we'd come back and have some more cocktails. And, this guy was really strange. And what he did is, among many things he taught me was how to create trans-Yuguan icons. Now, an icon, I'm not talking about computer icons now. An icon is like a sacred painting in the Orthodox Church. If you go into like a Greek Orthodox church or whatever, you see these icons of Mary or Jesus or whatever, Well, those are believed in the Orthodox religion to be windows to heaven. Well, what these things were, they were windows to hell. They were windows to other dimension, other space-time continua. And he taught me how to do that. He created like these obscene portraits that were, I can't even describe them. And you could, by meditating in them, you could go into other universes. And I'll never forget, one night I spent in his apartment was enough to really scare me to pieces, because he had these paintings everywhere, oil paintings. And he had me sleep on a futon, which was in the middle of his living room. And as I was laying there, I would hear rustling sounds. And I'd turn on a light, and all of these weird plants that he had in the window had moved around. I won't even tell you what he watered them with. Then I would turn off the light, and I was a little freaked out by that, and I'd hear more rustling sounds. And I'd turn on the light, and the paintings on the wall had moved around. And at that point, I got out my rosary. It's like, Anton LaVey sleeps with a nightlight, right? And here's a great satanic priest, and I heard more rustling sounds. I turned on the light again. The paintings had moved some more, but not only that, the content of the paintings had changed. The figures in them had moved. And, I still get goosebumps about it. Anyway, the key thing that he taught me was how to open up portals to Sirius B and thence to Universe B. Let me explain what that means. You've probably heard, I think you heard, in fact, Michael talk earlier about the star system, the star Sirius. Sirius is a red giant star that's the most prominent star in the heavens. And it's in the Canis Minor constellation. It's called the Dog Star. And in fact, it's interesting. There's a line in Crowley's Book of the Law, is God to live in a dog? Because God and dog, God backwards is dog. Anyway, there's this strange tribe in Africa that for hundreds of years, part of it, they worship the star god Sirius. And interesting enough, one of the names of Sirius, which is the evilest star in the Egyptian pantheon, is the Eastern Star. So the next time you see those Order of the Eastern Star, nice little temples and everything, with their upside-down satanic pentagrams as their logo, think of that. Anyway, this tribe claimed that there was a dark twin to Sirius, even though they had no telescopes, they had no nothing. And they only found out after they got radio telescopes that Sirius does have a dark twin, and it's Sirius B. And magicians understand that by invoking Sirius B, they can go into other dimensions and other universes and conquer those universes, use the power from those universes to fuel their own magical power. That's part of Satanic theology. Next slide. You do this through what is called the tunnels of Typhon. And Typhon is an Egyptian destroyer god. Through the use of voodoo. See, a lot of people think voodoo is this very primitive, we looked at it very kind of, I hate to say it in a racist way, kind of condescendingly. It's actually an extremely sophisticated magical system. And you notice this word here, qliphote. Qliphote is the Hebrew word for shell or harlot. And this is the backside of the Kabbalistic tree of life. And it's the evilest part of all Jewish mysticism. And naturally, dummy me, I was invoking it. You travel through these tunnels of Typhon into other dimensions through non-Euclidean geometry, and we used applied evil and terror as energy constructs. I was taught how to perform masses to star gods and crystalline intelligences from other galaxies in order to gain more and more power. See, this is like a weird blend of Satanism and science fiction. And I guess that's what I want you to get off of this. Next slide. The other thing we did is he taught me in voodoo there is a thing called the Loras. These are like the great old ones of voodoo from an African perspective. And you see here this very strange, this is what's called a veve. And if you've ever looked at documentaries about Haiti and voodoo, they draw these either on buildings or they draw them with flour on the ground. They're extremely elaborate and they're used. This is like the veve of Danbala, who's one of their main deities. Next slide. Now, isn't this interesting? This is they call this Bois, Grand Bois des Îles, which means the great forest under the sea. And I learned from this guy that this is Cthulhu. This is their icon of Cthulhu. And notice how much it looks like an alien, a gray alien. Next slide. Now, this is my last autobiographical experience. Well, not quite. This was very illuminating. And I'll leave it to you whether this is actually something that happened in as an alien abduction or was a satanic ritual. I was home alone in my parents' house. My wife didn't come with me. I was visiting them. I was asleep in my bed. All of a sudden, I was carried out of my bed, thought I was dreaming. A lot of UFO abductees think that. I was carried up through the roof into outer space. I went through hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles of space out to one of the moons of Saturn. When I got to the moon of Saturn, I was placed down there, and there was this man who was one of my mentors in real life, an illuminous mentor, and he said, "Welcome to the Cathedral of Pain." I wasn't sure I liked the sound of that. There was this giant black obsidian, very obscene-looking building, unlike any, I can't even describe it. I tried to paint it once, and it didn't even come out right. I was led into this. Inside of this cathedral, the walls, instead of like stained glass like you might see in a normal cathedral, there were these like giant aquariums. And this ghostly blue light from these aquariums illuminated the cathedral. And floating in these giant tanks were hundreds of mutilated naked human bodies. Hundreds of them. Children, adults, men, women, didn't matter. And I was led up to this altar, and I was made to be strapped down on this altar. And all these people came out in black robes, and they were chanting in French, blasphemous things. Don't ask me why French, but they were. And then all of a sudden, on this throne in the distance, which I hadn't noticed before, this being started manifesting, scintillating. And it appeared part of the time to be a goat, a giant goat. Part of the time it appeared to be a winged bull, and part of the time it appeared to be a, did the screensaver go? Oh, there we go. And part of the time it appeared to be a beautiful blonde man. And this being came down to where I was laying strapped on this altar. I wasn't feeling too good about this. And he had these giant talons. He was like 20 feet tall. And he took one of his talons and he buried it in my forehead, right in my third eye. And I felt this searing pain. You can still see the scar. And it was like my whole brain turned into white-hot pain. And he said, "Now you belong to me, body, soul, and spirit." And then he pulled his hand out, and at that moment, like a thunderclap, I was falling back to earth at the speed of light, and I landed in my backyard in a mass of flame and lightning. And at that moment, oddly enough, what came to my mind are the words, oddly enough, of Jesus, where he said, "Behold, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." And the ground was actually smoldering around me. The lawn was this big mass of burned grass. And I just staggered back into the house and had the world's worst headache and fell asleep. And fortunately, my father didn't think to ask me why there was a big burned thing on the lawn the next day. Now, what was that? Was that an alien abduction? Was that a satanic initiation? You decide. Next slide. Finally, the Mormons have been mentioned a couple times, and I don't want to let anything I'm saying here be taken as that I'm attacking Mormons. Most Mormons are wonderful people, but a lot of them, if you know them, are obsessed with UFOs. If you look at the original story of how Mormonism started, Joseph Smith claims that he went off to pray into this grove that now Mormons call the Sacred Grove in upstate New York, near Palmyra. And he claims, now listen to this, not with the eyes of faith, but with the eyes of a UFO person, someone who's into UFOs. He claims that as he was kneeling and praying and asking God for wisdom of what church to join, all of a sudden this column of light came down from the heavens, and he felt enveloped by darkness. He felt like he had no energy, like he couldn't even cry out, and he felt as if he was almost going to suffocate in darkness. And then all of a sudden, from out of this light, two beings appeared, glowing in white. And they looked identical, and one being said to the other, "This is my beloved son, hear him." And the other being told Joseph Smith not to join any church, but rather to wait for further instructions. I'm paraphrasing here. Now, you could say, well, that was a heavenly vision. Or you could say, were those two UFO nauts? It's interesting, because there's a lot of science fiction elements in Mormonism. For example, how many of you realize that Mormons teach that the God of Mormonism, Heavenly Father, is actually an extraterrestrial being? He's a man just like you and me with body parts and passions. That's their terminology. From the planet Kolob at the heart of the galaxy. In fact, how many of you realize that the guy that created the science fiction show Battlestar Galactica back in the 70s was a Mormon, Glenn Larson. And he incorporated a lot of Mormon ideas into that science fiction show. Joseph Smith claimed he had seer stones, which looked like this, and he could put them on, and they were universal translators. He could translate any language, any ancient language, didn't matter. Faithful Mormons are also taught that they will get their own star systems someday, where they will reign over their own star systems as gods and goddesses. And as Mormons, we would keep running into Mormons who were very sure that Jesus was a space alien. And he was going to return to Earth on a spaceship to Missouri. That's where the Garden of Eden really is, in case you didn't know that. It's in Missouri. It's a place called Adam on Diamond. Now, what's interesting, next slide, as we drove out to Utah to be sealed in the temple for time and all eternity, we were buzzed continually by UFOs at night, especially as we drove through, as we started getting into western Nebraska or Kansas, whatever it was, and into Utah. We'd see UFOs pacing us all the time. It was very, very weird. Then some very strange things happened in the temple. When we went to the temple, my wife gave a secret word that she had been given by the Grand Master Druid to be entered into the Mormon computer, because they used computers to track their temple attendees. This is even way back in 1981. As soon as they typed the word in, the entire computer system crashed. They emptied the temple, and especially she, was taken through alone. And during that time, she saw some reptilians underneath the temple, in the basements of the temple where the endowments are done. There's also the strange case of the Seattle temple. That temple was built back in the late 80s, and right at the time they were building it, I used to work for a gentleman named Ed Decker who runs Saints Alive in Jesus, and they had some interesting ideas on guerrilla warfare. What they did is in the night, when they were getting ready to pour the foundation for the Seattle temple, they snuck in there and they put a copy of the Bible underneath each one of the pylons before they poured the concrete. And they said that's the only temple in the Mormon church that's built on the word of Yahweh. Hallelujah. Well, then they ended up, and then you know what they did to make matters worse? They waited until the temple was about 90% done, and they called them and said, guess what? We did. Anyhow, you got to love these guys. Then, when the Mormon prophet came to pray over the temple, to give the dedicatory prayer over the temple, just like Solomon did, you know, in 1 Kings, they were the whole prayer team from Saints Alive. I'll tell you, this is spiritual warfare at its finest, brothers and sisters. We're up on the hill praying against him and binding all the false, lying, and deceitful spirits. Now, you got to understand something about Mormon temples. Mormons believe that they do work for the dead, and that if they baptize like their dear departed grandmother so they can become Mormons in the spirit world, that often these people will come from beyond the grave and manifest and tell them, oh, thank you for helping me to get into heaven. Thank you for helping me become a Mormon here in the spirit world. Thank you for letting me out of spirit prison. Well, you know what? In this temple, these people, nice Mormon people, were seeing lizards 6 feet tall running down the corridors of the temple. It was like the demons were not able to deceive. They were being seen for what they really were, whether they were fallen angels or whatever, I don't know what they were, but we had many women, especially women have more sense about these things than men do, amen? And they just said, I want out of this church, I don't care what I got to do. And they came, and we got more than a dozen different women coming and saying that they were seeing like these 6 foot tall giant lizards running through the halls of the Seattle temple. So make that, and then the funny other thing is that there's been numerous reports. We have at least 2 people that have said when they were underneath the Mormon temple, because there's like 5 or 6 levels beneath the Salt Lake Temple. And believe it or not, they would see reptilian beings under there. Next slide. Now, obviously, some of what I've shared here could be called anecdotal evidence. But from this partially historical and partially autobiographical narrative, I've drawn some strong, some strong conclusions can be drawn. Next slide. It is evident that right before the rise of the modern flying saucer era, an extraordinary convergence of spiritual forces were coming together. The Theosophical Society and Spiritism, Crowley's influence, Lovecraft's popularization of the concept of dreadful star gods lurking over the earth. Next slide. In my own life and career in the occult, UFOs and aliens, notice this, always seemed to be waiting in the wings. They were always there. Today, more than ever before, this synergy between the occult and UFOs is growing. And we, as the body of Messiah, must stop hiding our head in the sand and respond to this need. Next. I believe the only answer to this tag team of black magic and black science is the power and healing of the Holy Spirit. We as a church must respond both intellectually but also compassionately to the millions of hurting and deceived people who are out there. And if we don't do it, who's going to, brothers and sisters? Thank you, and Yahweh bless you. Yeah, if you have time.
We'll start 5 or 10 minutes late on Patrick or 10 or 15.
I have a question.
Yes.
Baptism of the dead and the living, what does that do and what is that for?
The question is, what is the baptism for the dead in the Mormon church? They believe that everybody who dies without hearing the Mormon gospel is basically put in a holding pattern in spirit prison, in the spirit world. And then that's why they do all this genealogy work. And they believe that if you, like when my grandfather died, for example, I went and got all of his information, and I took that information to the temple, and then I went through and did all of this stuff for him by proxy. And the baptisms, you're baptized by proxy for these various dead people. And they believe that at that moment, up in spirit prison, 2 Mormon missionary angels go to this individual and say, here's the Mormon gospel, do you accept it or not? And if they say yes, let out of spirit prison and they go right up to the celestial kingdom. Now, what it does in reality is absolutely nothing, except give the Mormons something to do. You know, but I mean, like for example, Martin Luther is now a Mormon. John Calvin is now a Mormon. John Knox and Zwingle, all the great reformers are all Mormons. They've all been baptized from beyond the grave.
So it's satanic ceremony?
Well, it's only satanic in the sense that it's a deception. I mean, it's not in any way, there's nothing sinister about it. They don't really baptize dead bodies, but I mean, they.
I know, I've experienced it.
Okay.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah. That's the idea. Did you have a thought?
I was just gonna ask, is that when Paul talks about the baptizing the dead, baptism of the dead in 1 Corinthians, I think it's 15?
Yes.
Is that what it's referring to?
Well,
Or similar?
that's the verse the Mormons use to hang that practice on. And you go to 5 different Bible commentaries, you'll get 5 different explanations, and I don't really think we know for sure what Paul was talking about. Yes, sir.
I'd like for you to stick your neck out on the line. I hear that as a Mormon, that you have to go through a temple rinse ritual to slit your throat, spill your bowels. That you let go of the secrets that happened there. Could you tell us? And also that they're very similar to Masons and the Mormons do the exact same thing. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Okay, he's asking about if there are like penal things in the Mormon religion, in the temple, that involve swearing oaths and stuff that are similar to Mormonism, Masonry, and yes, they're very similar to Masonry. You like for the first sign of the Aaronic priesthood in the temple is you go like this. That's also the due guard or the penal sign of the entered apprentice, which is the first degree in Masonry. Now, just since we wrote our book, Mormonism's Temple of Doom, back in 1987, the Mormons cleaned up their temple rituals a little. They got rid of some of that stuff. But back before, it was 91 that they made the change. Back before that, all that stuff was in there. Yeah, you'd be making gestures like you're being disemboweled or having your body cut in two, things like that, yes. Someone that.
Have you met the angel Moroni?
Only when doing demonic deliverance. He asked if I'd met the angel Moroni. Moroni is the angel you see on top of the Mormon temple spires, and he's supposedly a dead prophet. They believe when you die, if you're righteous, you become an angel. So he's like a dead prophet from the ancient Americas. And yeah, oddly enough, Moroni shows up as a demonic strongman with Mormons when we pray for them to be set free. Yes, sir.
What group that you did mention that you're affiliated with? Jehovah's Witness?
Never was Jehovah's Witness.
I don't know if you had any information on them compared to these other groups. And also, some of your comments and your own personal religious experience almost sound to me some of the words like Messianic Jew type experience. Can you share a little bit about your current faith right now? I mean, some of the language things. I didn't know.
I am Torah observant. I do go to a Messianic congregation. I learned partially as a Mormon that when I did genealogy that I had some Jewish blood in my ancestry, and so that's why I use the name Yahshua or Yeshua, and why I use the name Yahweh is because those are the ancient Hebrew names for the Father and the Son. So I guess we're out of time at this point. So thank you. I know I went over time, but bless you and thanks for your patience.